Welcome, my friends. This is Chapter 3, Physical Growth and Development During Infancy. In this chapter, we're going to be looking at how these physical changes that are happening in the developing child's brain are interlinked with the child's developing ability to think and process information and experience cognition. Let's get into it. Hope you're doing well. I just want to take a second too to say that my interactions with you so far, I've really appreciated you Nipissing students. You're a good group. Nice people, hardworking. And I just noticed that. I just appreciate that. I know I'm only interacting with you in one course, and you have a bunch of teachers, and I have no idea what your classes are like with other teachers, but I've enjoyed interacting with you. Um, yeah. It's been a slice. Let's move on to the presentation. Okay, so welcome. Hope you have a coffee. You're ready to go, and let's get into looking at this physical and cognitive development in infancy. Yeah. I said to my wife today, she said, how do I look? I said, oh, you look excellent cephalocatally. And she was like, what's that mean? And this is a made up story. I didn't say this. I'm trying to just present this word. Cephalocatally means top to bottom, basically, but basically more literally means head to tail. It means the body doesn't start as an egg and sort of expand out. It's like a 3D printer that prints down. And it's a weird concept, but it's why you can control your eyes before you can control your mouth. You can control your hands before you can control your feet. We're talking about babies. It's even why going like this is easier than going like this. That even within my arm, my ability to move my arm came before my ability to move my fingers. That there seems to be this head down and then middle out, and that's going to be the word on the next slide. So I said there's kind of two big words that characterize how a baby develops physically, and the first one is a cephalocattal, and it's a huge word, but it's just you just have to view it as it's just a Latin word. It just means top to bottom or head to tail, and it means that the head, and you've heard me kind of do some rants on this already, but one of the most amazing things about pregnancy is the fact that it seems like everything is lined up to have the biggest brain possible born. Everything to how the women's hips are, to how the baby's is born with their head not completely formed, so that it can force through and then grow a bit more. That's all about increasing the potential that this creature, or not the creature, the baby that's born is smart. That it really seems like the whole human reproduction magic, I was going to say the word science, but you can switch the words if you'd like, comes down to this idea of how do we get a baby born with the ability to develop cognitively as fully as possible. Right? If women's hips were small, if women's hips were designed differently, let me just say it like that, and if the child's head was bigger, we would lose more mothers in pregnancy. It's like this Goldilocks principle of not too big, not too small, just right. And it seems like evolution is like that, over and over and over and over and over and over again. And if you want to, you could even refer to it as a Goldilocks principle. Goldilocks principle is actually a word from astrology that means another planet that's not too hot for life and not too cold for life, but just right for life. A Goldilocks planet would be like a planet that has Earth-like conditions, right? So that's this is a bit of a side note, but if anyone hasn't heard of it, Goldilocks is basically like a story I tell my daughter about the bear that, Goldilocks and the three bears, and the bear comes in and the one porridge is too cold and the one is too hot, but there's one that's just right, and the one bed's too short and the other bed's too long, and the other one's just right. That whenever anyone says Goldilocks, they mean that perfect in between. The baby's born, if you're like, can you get off Goldilocks? Okay, I'll move on from Goldilocks. That the baby's born with their head being huge in proportion to the rest of their body, right? Meaning like the amount, think of like Stewie on Family Guy for like an exaggerated example, but the idea that the head is much bigger than percentage wise of the body than it will be when that child is an adult. This idea that physical growth and feature differentiation, so feature differentiation, and like differentiation is one of these words that it's saying that parts of your body do different things, but instead of saying parts of your bodies do different things, or cells in your brain do different things, we say that they differentiate. They do different things. I don't know. It sounds smarter if you're doing a presentation. You say that they differentiate, but it just means they do different things. And that happens within the head too. It's like there's a race to, for example, develop your eyesight. And it seems to be being prioritized over things like developing your ear canal. So that's kind of my point. It's not like everything's like 5%, 6%, 7%, 8%, 9%. It's like different parts are developing at different speeds. The top parts of the head, the eyes and the brain grow faster than the lower parts. So wild. It's like what you want to talk about it, right? It either comes down to God or nature, and you can, and you know, you're adults, you can look at it how you look at it. But either way, it's completely mind blowing if you can step back and look at it. Like this idea of how the baby almost 3D prints, and that infancy, yeah, they can see objects before they can control their torso and use their hands. So like they can see things before they can move to those things. They can use their hands to play with things way before they can crawl and walk. One of the reasons walking is like a kind of final milestone for showing the neural connectivity between the brain and body is because that connection to your toes from your brain is literally the longest connection in your body. And that's if you're, this is a kind of dumb thing to say. I shouldn't say stupid. I'm trying not to say stupid because I have a 6-year-old and trying not to, that's a word we're trying not to say. But anyways, if your feet were on your hands, you would control them first. It's almost this idea of because you got to think of it, that's kind of wild, right? Like now as an adult, you're like, you can move your feet however you want and stuff, but it's weird to think there was a time when you could control your hands, but you had much less control over what your feet were doing, right? Because like obviously a 1-year-old can't walk, but they can certainly put things in their mouth and eat, and right? So it's this idea that part of how the baby's growing is top down. I was trying to be more concise in this presentation. I'm already on 7 minutes on the first slide, but the eyes and the brain go faster than the lower parts. I already read that part. Okay, next slide. Okay, so for the quiz coming up, I do want you to know these 2 words, right? And these are words that if one thing I always tell my Conestoga students, and I don't know if it's relevant for you, but I think it is. When you're learning a topic like psychology, it's helpful to view it as partially learning a language, right? You could have learned language, you could have known English your whole life and never come across the word cephalococcygeal. To be completely honest, before I started teaching courses on this, I don't know if I'd even seen it. Maybe I saw it when I took a course related to like infant development, but it's a kind of, it's like it'd be a killer Scrabble word, but like my point is that don't overthink the words. They basically just mean something though that's actually pretty interesting, that the baby, if you look at that image that has the 2 blonde kids, and it's like the baby's basically growing from the top down and from the middle out. That's what proximodissal means. Again, another kind of tongue twister, but proximity just means distance. So, and modissal, I think it just basically means like the direction in which the movement goes. And it basically goes from the middle out. So you'll notice you could basically draw a T down your body. right? And what you would have is like your brain, behind at the back of this T is like the whole spinal column. You go across your heart and lungs and basically end at the groin area. And then it's like that's basically the primary axis, and everything kind of grows out from that. It's weird to think that like your parts are not all growing at the same speed. They're growing cephalocatally and proximodiscally, which again is just a fancy way of saying from the top down and from the middle to the sides. Okay, so here you can see, and you don't have to write this down. This isn't something that like you don't have to like capture this chart in your notes or anything. But you could kind of have the list that, starting from birth and moving towards 12 months, towards even beyond 12 months. Because lots of kids, like my kid, this is where you got to be careful with things like milestones, right? Like my kid just turned 2. How long has she been walking? A few months. So she would be like a few months later than this chart would suggest. And my second kid, like Charlotte, she didn't crawl too much. She was super active. And then all of a sudden, like now, if you saw her, she's like, her birthday was in July, so she's like a few months older than 2. And I'm like, it's everything in me to like keep up with her, right? She's like ripping around constantly. So a lot of this, I was actually just talking about this with some people the other day, is one of the major changes that's happened in psychology over the last 100 years or so, or maybe it's actually, this is just a point from your chapter 1 presentation. I'm just having deja vu from when I recorded it. But one of the biggest changes has been less focus on like constantly stressing about norms, right? That, oh, you have to toilet train by this age and you have to walk by this age and you have to, and it's like, well, if the kid is loved and the kid has attention and the kid's in a scenario where they're getting decent nutrition, they're probably going to catch up on basically everything by the time they're about 3. And now I'm not saying like any kid, like there could be scenarios where like an abusive situation where a kid's not getting any stimulation, and that's obviously an abusive situation. But what I'm really talking about is more like the mom that's really worried because their baby's getting over 2 and still dealing with toilet stuff, or maybe even getting over 3 and still dealing with toilet training stuff. And all of a sudden, it's just not an issue anymore. And again, remember Freud, even Freud, right back to the beginning, said like don't overly fixate on those things. He even used that word fixate. Fixate. It's like you can't. It's on your mind. You can't get it off your mind. You're fixed on it. You're fixated on it. He's like. So, anyways, it's important to note, because if your kid's way behind other kids, because that's all the norms are. Norms aren't like some holy scripture. What norms are let's look at 100,000 kids and see on average when they do certain things, and that's what the norm is. Saying normal and saying average is basically the same word. Okay. So again, it's like everyone's not average. It's like, look at all your friends. It's like, is there a kind of average amount of humor across your friends? Of course not. Some are funny, some are less funny. Is there an average amount of emotion? It's like, of course not. People are different. Is there an average amount of activity? Of course not. Some of your friends would way rather sit around, a campfire and tell stories. Some would rather skydive or something. Like that's a weird spectrum, but I guess that is pretty decent spectrum from relaxed to super immersive. But back to the lecture at hand. The baby goes through these like kind of predictable steps, right? Like you see early on, it's starting to prone, or prone just means like I don't know if you're doing some kind of physical training, they might get you to do prone exercises where you basically lie on your stomach and lift your upper body up like a Superman pull-up kind of thing, just like lying on the floor, and it would be like it's like basically a low back exercise. But babies start doing that. That's one of the first things they start doing. Um, is being able to lift their head. Then you start to see a bit of rolling, you start to see a bit of stooping, which is represented by that third picture. Basically looks like the kid's like almost in a push-up position, but you could see how that would be related to developing. My kid did that, tons of that kind of stuff. I actually have funny pictures over here. I should maybe put one on the sides because it almost looked like it. Like you can look at that third picture and see how it looks like that baby's sort of doing yoga, right? Like it's funny how babies, just the way that they would, yeah, just their flexibility. Like my baby will just like roll back and just like grab her ankles and just like pull them like just something that if I did that I'd have like a back injury for a month. But it's like babies are just incredible in every way. They're in a developmental process, and some of that development's their brain, some of it's their body, some of it is that they're set up to do certain things. So it's like the head's more vulnerable for the baby because it's especially when the baby's first born because it's not fully formed. So avoiding hits to the head are super important, but it's amazing when you see kids play a lot, especially like rough and tumble play, which is super important. And how much kids don't get hurt is the point I'm trying to make. Is interesting. The body's very resilient. Um, anyways, let me just finish this list. So then, like sitting, standing, climbing, walking. And again, this is where it's saying like this is called milestones. So I was saying this to the class the other day because you either love or hate this about me, or maybe you don't care. But I tend to break down words, and I think it's helpful to think of like what's a milestone. A milestone is like when you're like literally building a stone wall on like think of like I was just in Scotland. Think of like these huge fields. They're building like long walls, and then like every mile you put a bigger marker stone, and then you keep working on the wall, and then every mile you put another marker stone, so it tells you how far you've went. And that's kind of like what this is saying. It's like each one of those red lines is a new marker stone or whatever. That's just what the word milestone means. I don't know why I felt the need to explain it. Okay, the next slide. So understanding the brain. I got to be careful because I always, whenever I'm like clicking on the points, I have a tendency to just ramble incoherently. So I'm gonna try to tighten that up. Okay, if you see this here, it says developmental cognitive neuroscience. It's like, well, that's a bit of a mouthful, but what you want to think of that is whenever you see something like that that looks like three different subjects in a row, the subject that it is always the last one. Sorry, and the first words always describe the type of the last one. So what we're talking about here is neuroscience. We're talking about the study of the chemistry and the processes of the neurons, the brain. Although there's neurons in your gut, and we're looking at how the cognitive aspect of it, so like the processing of it, and then we're also looking at how that processing in your brain develops, like where how that goes from being one place and eventually is working at a different level, right? How it's upgrading, if you want to use computer language, that there's this extensive brain development that happens um, from birth to infancy. By the time that someone's 2, now think about this. When my daughter was 2, she was about 30 pounds. 25 pounds. 20 pounds. I don't know. I'm freestyling this. Let's use 20 pounds for easy math. Say the baby's 20 pounds. Now, when she's an adult, that's only like, let's say, Again, my maths this year, I'm just exposing myself for being not very good at doing math on the fly. But let's say she's like 120, 150 pounds, whatever. It's like whatever weight she is. I just backed myself into an awkward example, but my point is that when she's at 20 pounds, her brain is almost full size. Her body is nowhere near full size, is the point I'm saying. She's probably going to put on at least 100 more pounds, right? Again, please give me some grace. I'm obviously like struggling with that math example, but because I'm trying not to like, I'm like, okay, what's a good step back? My point that I'm trying to say is it's amazing how much the brain's development is prioritized. So much so that by the time a baby's only 2 years old, their brain is 75% of its adult weight. The rest of its body is like, whatever, 5% of its adult weight. So that stat is designed to show you the importance and the primacy of brain development, even though I had that awkward kind of way of trying to say it. And that what's happening is that once the baby's born, now, because I mentioned in the last presentation that in the womb, almost all of the brain development is genetically programmed, which again, easy to say, infinitely complicated to explain what saying that the genetics are developing the brain means. But basically, we talked about this last time, how DNA has information in it, and that information is directing the development of the brain when the baby's in the womb. Then the baby's born into the world, and there's all these voices and shadowy people, and because they're seeing mainly shadows at the beginning, and smells and tastes and mom. And this is the baby beginning its interactions with their environment, and these interactions with the environment affect that kind of next step in cognitive development. And we all know that, like obviously, like a baby being in situations where they're like stimulated in the sense of like, well, we would all know if you took a baby and just put it in a high chair in a corner staring at a wall all day that that's wrong. And then if I say, well, why is that wrong? And like not like, obviously that's wrong, right? Okay, so let's just start with that. I'm not like advocating for neglecting your kid. I'm saying it's actually interesting to put it that way, because then if I ask you to describe why it's wrong, you start making an argument for the developmental importance of things like eye contact, playing games, how the interaction that's established early between mom and baby is actually what teaches the baby what relationship is, what trust is. It actually starts to form a model that becomes that baby's understanding of others. At birth, the infant that began as a single cell has a brain that contains tens of billions of nerve cells. Another way of saying nerve cells that are processing information is neurons. At birth, the brain weighs about 25% of its adult weight. Extensive brain development continues throughout birth. After birth through infancy and even later. By the second birthday, the brain's about 70% of its adult weight. I just have another point. I'm just being careful because if I click on the wrong spot, it flips to the next slide and it messes this recording. And I'm 6 minutes deep. So because the brain's developing so rapidly in infancy, the infant's head should be protected from falls and other injuries. And it's also why a baby should never be shaken. But the baby's brain does not simply get larger. Through its interactions with its environment, individual neurons and connections are shaped, allowing for the development of more advanced things, like it says there, like perception, language, complex thought. That too, like, I could hardly list three things that were more difficult to explain: perception, language, and complex thought. Like, what does it mean to say that? And we're going to get into this actually in this presentation. Not on the next slide, but soon. Sensation is you You walk by a room and you smell something. The smell is a sensation. You thinking that smells good or you thinking that smells gross is a perception. And now, perception is almost like a judgment-filled interpretation of your sensation. But where psychology teachers explain this poorly is, and this comes from a book that I read that was really interesting called The Primacy of Perception, which basically means, and I don't really like that author, that's Merleau-Ponty, and he has issues for other reasons, along with a lot of the postmodernists. But anyways, his one point that I like is this idea that it's not like you see things and then think about how you think about it and then make a value judgment. That perception is right up with sensation. You see a beautiful woman or a guy walk into a room, you make that decision that you find them attractive so fast that if I asked you to tell me why you think they're attractive, you're probably going to tell me incorrect information. That if I could actually study your brain like a computer, I would see that you made split-second calculations that told your brain, like, whoa, that person's attractive. And it's like, it's not why you think it is. And that's true for me too. It's not like I'm like talking down to you. Keep that in mind with basically every point I make in this class, right? It's just because I'm talking to you as the group. But all this stuff like applies to me too. So it's just a user manual on humans. Okay, next. So this is an area where I want to be kind of blunt with the language, because it can be confusing, because usually when we say in common speech, you'll hear people say like brain cells. And there's different kinds of cells, basically, which again is fascinating because originally they're all coming from the same source, but they start to do different things. Differentiate, that word I said before, right? So that's to say that cells start to do different things, so much so that then you could almost say there's different types of cells, right? And one type of cell is characterized, or what makes it what it is characterized, is that it processes information. Now, what that means is mind-blowing, because it obviously doesn't have like RAM. It's not like a computer. But to say that you think in your head and you're processing information, and there's obviously got to be a physical part that's doing that. Your thoughts aren't just like floating clouds. They're like, well, they're mainly electrical and biochemical reactions. If we were to look at it from a chemistry perspective, they're physical. Your thoughts are physical, completely physical. They're real things. A lot of your thoughts are things you've just heard other people say, though. They're not necessarily all original. But again, that's just a random side point that I don't know why I said, but it's true. So basically all I'm saying is that there's neurons and brain. Saying a neuron and saying a brain cell is basically saying the same thing, but I wanted to give you that disclaimer that you do have neurons in your gut. There's neurons in other parts of the body that process information, and that's kind of newer finding. And the findings they're finding about like what we used to always call like your gut instinct, which we now know is just this microbiome, is fascinating. We've called it gut instincts for like hundreds of years. It's fascinating that new studies are showing that there's cells processing information in your gut. Cells that we would traditionally think of as more normally mentioned as like related to brain cells, which is pretty darn interesting. It's not like your gut has a brain, but it's like your gut has cells that process information in ways that your elbow doesn't have cells that do that. Again, that's a silly way to say it, sort of, but I think I'm just trying to make it digestible, I guess. So neurons are things that can send signals to other neurons. That's another thing, is like, and this is where we see, like in a cell like this, that it has these So the nucleus is like the circle in the middle. That's where all the action's happening. And then you have these branch-like things sticking off, right? And those are what are called dendrites. And you can almost think of those as, those are like receivers looking for information. And so every cell has the ability to bring in information and also the ability to shoot out information. And sometimes it shoots out information electrically. Now, in most smaller mammals, most things in the animal kingdom, their brain's much more electric. Me going like this, that's almost all electrical. Like me having a depressed thought about a missed friend, that's chemical. And so a lot of the more complicated stuff is chemical. A lot of the more hardwired stuff, and it's interesting that I even use the word wired, right? Because that kind of, what do you think of wiring? You think of electricity. But then here's the thing. If this shocks this, or if this sends, not shocks literally, but sends charge, action potential is the word they use in biology, but it just, again, this is what I want to challenge you to do, is see some of these fancy words as just what they are. They're just fancy words. Action potential just means that if this cell's sending energy to this cell, it sends it, and it's like there's this action of potential energy. They call it action potential, but again, it's, if you see through the language a bit, it's not as complex. It's well, it is complex. It's like nature itself is complicated enough. We don't have to use tricky language. What's happening is that again, it's like I glitched. But what's happening is the most complicated thing that we know of in the universe, how human beings form complex thoughts. You have an electric biochemical brain. That's the most complicated thing about you. And it's also, in a lot of ways, it's the most awesome thing about you. It's incredible. Right? It's so normal to us, though. Okay. But again, just because things like how we think and use language, and pregnancy, for example, like pregnancy is something that like is so common that it's not until you stand back and kind of look at it and look at how many scenarios there are for factors to go just a little bit wrong and it not to work at all, and how it works so many times, and how like we're all here as a result of it. And that just because it's common and just because we've come to just take it as a given, that's sort of just our value-laden perception of it. It's still fantastic. Okay, anyways, next slide. So in terms of like in terms of like the test and stuff, I do want you to know the cephalosaccadal and the proxidomiso, and I want you to know what I told you that I wanted you to know earlier. Those two words I started with, cephalosaccadal and proxidomiso, and then if I want you to know like that a neuron is a cell that processes information, that an axon is, okay. So now let's just simplify this. My phone has a mic that when I'm talking on the phone, I talk into, and it sends that to the other person. But it also has a receiver so that when you talk back to me, I hear it through my speaker. So it's like my cell phone has a mic and a speaker, and you could view. It's the best way to, because this is going to be like the opposite. Basically, it has an ability to bring in and send out. Axons is the sending out. That's communicating a message to a different cell. And a dendrite are all those. So basically, it has an Well, I'll talk more about axons in a second, but basically the cell has the ability to send a message out, and it sends it out using axons, and it has an ability to be sent information or receive information from other cells. And that's all the tree branch looking things that actually kind of look like antennas, right? Like they're waiting to have a signal. And some of the signals they can accept are electric, like I was saying, and some of them are re-upping or like picking up molecules dropped off by the other cell, like something like serotonin. So again, and I'm not trying to like be too simple, but I'm trying to talk simply about something that's complicated and say that let's look at it like each cell. When we say that the cells in our brain are communicating and neuroconnective, what that means is that they're sending messages to each other. And in order to do that, the individual cell needs to be able to get a message and give a message. It gives the message with the axon. It gets the message through the dendrites. Dendrites just means like, I think it's like Latin for like branches. And you can kind of visually see why it's like that. Okay. So if you look at this, right, I sometimes I'll use this kind of an example. If you look at like this is just like a pair of, regular headphones. You see like how there's the white plastic coating on the outside of I don't know if it would still be a copper wire, but the wire in the middle. And you can view the blue here as the wire and the myelin as the plastic coating on the outside. And so just to break this down for a sec, obviously this is just like a way of trying to explain it, right? What I'm basically saying is that these axons, or these parts of the cell, have this protective coating forming around it, similar, because if you're like, okay, well, what happens if, say I had this plugged in and this cord gently touches the cord that the mic's attached to? It's like, well, if they weren't both surrounded by a plastic coating, they would probably short each other, right? And it's like the same thing is true in the brain. The connections need to be protected, and actually the breakdown of that and them touching is actually, that misfiring in the brain is actually associated with what you've probably heard of as like MS or multiple sclerosis, is oftentimes related to a breakdown of these myelins. So another way to explain it is if you had a sword and the sword's in its case. Another word for the case of a sword is a sheath. So a sheath is like a protective case. So myelin, think of it as, it's like literally like a fatty substance that, okay, so another way of talking about this is saying your eye developing to its full potential, which happens in babies around by the time they're about 1. Part of that is the physical growth of the eye, the actual like development of those connections. But another part of it is that those pathways then get myelinated, which means the connections aren't just there, they're also protected and covered in this substance. And what this substance does is it protects misfiring, basically, and it also makes for faster communication. It's almost like all these roads are there, and now the roads are all like contained within tunnels, or you can think of it like that. Or again, the probably better metaphor is the plastic coating on the outside of a cord. And that's why, like, I can take my mic cord here and actually touch it to like the cord that is connecting the Ethernet or whatever, and they don't like because I'm just touching plastic to plastic. It's just myelin to myelin, kind of is the idea. So myelination means the process of that happening. So I didn't finish my thought about vision. The idea is that part of your vision getting to its complete stage is the development of those pathways, but it's not kind of finished until those pathways are then protected with myelin. And so it's one major difference you can see. You can see that the eyes and the pathways, and I'm going to show you like better way of explaining this about the eyes specifically, but when I say that you reach adult vision by 1 and you don't reach adult hearing until 6, part of what I'm talking about is the speed of myelination, right? That even in your brain, like connections are being made, and then they're being almost like hardwired and protected. And you could call that process myelination. This process of encasing axons in a fat, so the part of the cell that sends information, with a fatty, yeah, just saying fat cells. It's basically, if you're like wondering like what actually is the chemical, like, so I'm basically saying what I'm saying metaphorically as plastic that's on the outside of the wire, it's actually in your brain, it's like a fatty substance. It's like almost a gel. And it allows, I say there, energy, provides energy to the neurons. So it's actually important in its uptake and maintenance. And it also facilitates communication. So it makes the communication better and faster. And we see the results, and I referenced quickly, and I'll come back to this later, but this idea of how multiple sclerosis is an example of a situation where there's a problem in this area of degenerating myelin. And what that does is it interferes with the clearness and the specificness of the messages being sent. And that's why sometimes it's associated with things like more uncontrolled body movements. It's a signaling issue. So the two words on the screen, right? You have been writing about this for a while, so you've probably written this down. That one is talking about the process, myelination, and the other one's basically talking about what it is. So what it is this fatty substance on the outside of the cell, that, or on the outside of the axon of the shell, the information sending part of the cell that protects it, and the process of that developing is what's called myelination. This is one part where it's a little bit complicated, because I was saying before that the dendrites, like the part that's receiving the messages, are called that because they look kind of branchy. And if you look at this, it looks kind of branchy too, but this is different. This is the end that has, and it kind of makes sense, right? That those are reaching out to the branch parts of other cells. And what they're actually doing is either sending, well, in these scenarios, when we're talking about neurotransmitters, right? Because it'd be a little bit different in the scenarios where it's an electrical charge. But say if we're talking about something like serotonin, and we're looking at this and saying like, okay, for a chemical to go from cell to cell, transmit, brain cell to brain cell, neurally, neurotransmit, send from one neuron to another. That's what a neurotransmitter does. But what we're literally talking about is what the term terminal buttons means, like the end tip of those that basically releases a chemical, and then the other side picks it up. So there's like an anxiety medication called serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and what that's trying to do is aim at how much, at this process, at the serotonin reuptake, so it gets dropped by one and uptaked by the other one. And uptake is just a weird way of saying picked up. Okay, so these all I want you to kind of know is this idea that, and this is why chemical reactions in the brain are more advanced than electrical, because electrical, it's always the same message. Chemical, since it could drop different chemicals or the same chemical in different quantities, gives for more variety of types of messages that can be sent. And that's why I'm saying it's sort of, well, not sort of, it's higher order. It's more advanced. And what's literally happening is at the end here, these little finger-looking things have the ability to drop a chemical that then gets picked up by the dendrites, the branches parts of a different cell. And that's literally what a neurotransmitted message is. Transmit. Think of like, if I transmit a message, if I email you, it's like I've transmitted you a message. It's a weird way of saying it, but we would say like transistor radios, or like this idea of like radio, we used to think of it as transmissions. And this is older language. So a message sent and received. And then what that means when it's neural, right? So I'm just breaking down the word neurotransmitter. It just means messaging within neurons within the brain. Yeah, like the dendrites of the cell receive information from other neurons and muscles and glands throughout the body. The axon transmits information away from the cell. This myelin sheath that's covering the outside, which we were talking about, like the blue. So I'm just sort of breaking down the process of how the brain communicates at a cellular level, which is what we call neurotransmission, because of it's at a cell level, but the type of cell is neurons, and we're talking about how they transmit messages. So that's what a neurotransmitter is. And by this point, you're probably like, yeah, we get it. You've said it 9 times, but just trying to make it clear. Okay, next slide. This is one slide where I'm going to actually ask you to, if you could write down the 2 points there, that neurons change in 2 significant ways during the first year of life. One is through myelination, that this process of myelination, or kind of like hardwire, encasing the cells with this plastic coating, which is really a fatty substance, begins in the womb and continues all the way until adolescence. And actually, when you hear people say things like, well, the prefrontal cortex of teenagers isn't fully developed and that's why they take more risks, it's like, okay, well, what do you mean by that? It's like that part of their brain's there. It's not like it's not there. The myelination isn't complete yet, is the better way of saying it. The prefrontal cortex of a teenager, especially a younger teenager, is physically there. It's just not fully myelinated yet. So it's saying the changes that happen. Okay, so I'm saying that your brain cells basically change in 2 main ways during the first year of life. Number 1, the myelination that's changing and happening at different speeds in different places is one of the things that's changing your brain, literally, physically. And then the connections across the different information processing cells, neurons, is increasing, creating new neural pathways. So if you have that written down, I just want to read something to you. Okay, that your neurons change. This is just kind of a more long-winded way of explaining it, but those are the main points. That your neurons change in 2 very significant ways during the first year of life. First, through myelination, which is this process of encasing axons with a fat cell. It begins prenatally and continues throughout childhood into adolescence. The second thing is this connectivity, or the connectedness, amongst the neurons increases, creating new neural pathways. New dendrites grow. Connections amongst the dendrites increase. Again, I'm trying to click this so I don't accidentally click on the page and flip slides. And so the connections between the dendrites increase, and the synaptic connections between the axons and the dendrites proliferate, which is just a fancy way of saying the sending and receiving parts of all the different cells are connecting in all kinds of complicated ways. Myelination speeds up neurotransmission, and the expansion of these dendritic connections, again, just a fancy way of saying how the brain's connecting with itself, facilitates the spreading of neural pathways in the infant's development. So this is what's making the infant's brain. The cells are there. It's wiring. This is why childhood is so important. It's when the wiring is happening. This is interesting too. Researchers have discovered an intriguing aspect of this idea of synaptic connections. Synaptic density, the title of this slide, just means what it's showing there is like how if there's a cell and it's connected to another cell, I keep pointing to my bald head, but anyways, if there's a cell that's connected to another cell, and then it's connected to another cell, and another cell, and another cell, but then there's another cell that's only connected to a few, you would say the one that's connected to a bunch has more density. It has more amount and quantity of connections. So the more that all the different cells, and you would never have a cell that's only connected to one thing, but I was just saying that for illustrating point, that when you have all these connections, the more connections are heavy in an area, you'd say the more dense those synapses, because that synaptics is when there's a connection being made between 2, right? That's called a synapsis. Again, don't get lost in the language. It just means that some parts of your brain are more connected with other parts, like say your visual cortex, than other areas. And so researchers, back to this point, have discovered an intriguing aspect of synaptic connections, that nearly twice as many of these connections are made as will be used. So this is fascinating, that the infant's brains basically making twice as many connections as it will ever need. And then what it does is almost like prunes down, cuts away the unuseful ones. And that's part of what a maturing brain is. The connections that are used become stronger and survive, while unused ones are replaced by other pathways or disappearing completely. In the language of neuroscience, we call this pruning, like you're pruning a bonsai tree. Ready? So, to my lovely students, I'll just let you write this down. I kind of messed up how I'm presenting this slide. For whatever reason, I read the note of this slide on the last slide. It made complete sense with that slide too, but in your notes you have this made into 2 slides, so I'll just leave this up for a sec so you can write this down, because it's a kind of easier way of saying it. What I read in that note, that one of the things, again, dendritic connections sounds like so fancy. That just means like the connections in your brain. That the expansion of these connections in your brain is facilitates the spreading of neural pathways, blah, blah, blah. It just means like the fact that these are connecting more and more, there's more and more pathways, more and more pathways. Almost twice as many pathways are made as that will ever be used. The ones that get used repeatedly, okay, so going like this to eat, for example, like the ability to spoon feed yourself, which we're talking about infant development, remember? It's like that will, if it's used, it will. And now think about it again. I want you to constantly force yourself to step back and think of how, I wanted to use again the word wild. Again, the word wild and nature are the same word. How interesting it is that our nature is that we're born in a way that our brain creates twice the potential pathways, so that, and then based on what's working, we're constantly pruning. It's the smartest way you could possibly design a system to be high functioning. You would have it created with double its potential, and that it selectively kept things that were useful and pruned others. So like this whole idea of neural pruning is really interesting. Unused pathways are replaced by others. Sorry that I sometimes drop into those weird rants, but I think again, reminding yourself of the majesticness of everything is, an antidote to feeling depressed sometimes. It's like it's wild to think that we're magnetized to this spinning rock in the middle of a vastly unknown universe. It's like, don't get too stressed about little things. Okay, next slide. Not like that's easy. Everybody stresses about little things, but you're good people, good students. I wish you the best. Weird way to end a slide, but let's go to the next slide. Also, if you're interested, like all these notes that I'm saying are in the PowerPoint, and I'm not like doing anything to trick you. I'm not going to be pulling random questions that are somewhere deep in a note and putting it on a test. Almost all my notes are just to like basically describe more what I'm talking about. So really, I've really tried to design it that like most of the key information is actually like on the slide. The reason I'm saying that though is just for some things like we're about to get on the next slide into the different lobes of the brain, or even stuff like this. I don't think I actually have a note for this slide, so it's a weird slide to be making this comment on, but sometimes you'll see I have like a little bit of extra stuff. Like for example, when we start breaking, I mentioned like when we start breaking down the lobes or the areas of the brain, that could be like a whole lecture itself, but I'm just sort of touching on it, and I just want you to kind of have like a kind of base understanding. You don't have to, I'm not going to obviously like ask you to draw any of this or anything. Like for example here, the forebrain, which is basically like the cerebral cortex, or like the wrinkly part, but they sometimes talk about it like a wrinkled cap. Like it's a weird word too, but cap meaning like a hat, but like a wrinkled, and you could almost see it, right? That it's like the brain has this like top part, almost like the hat, that's like all wrinkled. Why is it wrinkled? Well, because that like massively increases the amount of surface area. It makes it actually bigger in a smaller area. It's a smart design too. All of this is so fascinating that there's this like, more ancient midbrain and hindbrain, and that are related to all these like deep rhythms of the body, sometimes called the reptilian or mammalian brain. But basically these earlier evolved aspects of us, and early evolved just meaning like we share these kind of things with a lot of the animal kingdom, But what's like uniquely what's interesting about the human brain, I'm gonna resist saying uniquely human because there's so many connections with other animals. I don't want to go on a long rant about chimps and dolphins, but the human forebrain is basically the cerebral cortex, the top part, and then some of the stuff beneath it, most notably the hippocampus, like the memory creation center. Then the cerebral cortex. So this covers the forebrain, right? So even again, right, it's weird because I just said it includes it, but you basically see the forebrain sort of like that area where the seahorse-shaped hippocampus is, and then the C-shaped upside down, and then the top part is the kind of most high-end processing. So this picture is, I guess my thing's backwards. So you're looking this way, or no, yeah, this way. This is so awkward. But where the F in forebrain is, your eyes are on that side, and it's looking that way, obviously. And so you could actually look, and you often see pictures of the brain like this, where this is actually a person looking that way with their brain sliced in half, and you're seeing the right side of it. And my hand position probably makes no sense because I think in PowerPoint my picture's mirrored, my video's mirrored. So anyways, there's two halves or two hemispheres, half of sphere, and there's different kind of areas, or what people call lobes, and there's sort of 4 lobes, and they're on both hemispheres, and they're very similar. So there's 4 lobes, each hemisphere has 4 lobes, and it's like the optical they're the same names on both sides, but they do very similar things, but not exactly the similar. So I would say they're slightly different in both anatomy and function. So they're not exact mirrors of each other, both in terms of physically and what they do, would be the way to say it. Because the hemispheres are slightly different, and it's fascinating. I'll try to break it down a little bit here in the next bit. All right, I want to talk a little bit about the lobes of the brain. Okay, so you have the 4 lobes, and all the lobes are on both sides. If you want to write that down, I want to just give you a little bit of an overview. You don't have to write all this down. This is going to be one of the more lengthy notes that I read to you. The frontal lobe is located at the front, obviously, right? The frontal front of each of the cerebral hemispheres, and it's positioned in front of the parietal lobe and above and in front of the temporal lobe. It was first discovered by Sir Nix de Janger. You don't need to know that. It's separated from the parietal lobe by a space between tissues called the central scalis, and from the temporal lobe by a deep fold called the lateral scalis, also called the sylvian fissure. Okay, I'm going to skip over some of this. I just want to focus on what it does. Right, heavily involved in things like the primary motor cortex, which includes the control of voluntary movement. So like things like me moving my hand like this on purpose. Contains the primary motor cortex. So things related to controlled movement, skilled movement, posture. It also contains a lot of dopamine delicate neurons. This dopamine system is associated with the reward system, right? So like our whole reward system lives in this frontal lobe. Our short-term memory, tasking, planning, all the things we would associate with short-term memory. Dopamine tends to limit and select sensory information arriving from the thalamus to the forebrain. So like dopamine's playing a huge role in moderating what we're paying attention to and what we're caring about. The frontal lobe consists of the prefrontal cortex, which is located in the most anterior, farthest away section of the frontal lobe. It's critical for working memory and executive control, which helps us keep focused and pay attention in complex situations. So it's basically, I'm saying the frontal lobe's like all your like high-end thinking. A lot of what you consider, well, thinking, yeah, like a lot of what your working memory is doing. My note, I just say, like talk a little bit more about the name. This is important for, yeah. Um, it's also important in the regulation of meaningful stimulus that a person experiences through their life, such as images and letters and names. Damage in this area can result in long-term issues with short-term memory. And again, short-term memory and working memory are the same thing, and it's really like to have, and this happens a lot, car accidents and fights and sports and stuff, when people get an acquired brain injury to their frontal cortex, their frontal lobe, especially the prefrontal cortex, which is part of that. So I say there, like damage can result from lesions or tumors or traumatic brain injuries. What else do I want to tell you about that? Okay, the parietal lobe, which is symbolized here by green, it's positioned above the occipital lobe and behind the frontal lobe. Again, I'm not going to drill you on the test on like the specifics of this. I basically want you to know, the frontal lobe is a lot of the higher end processing. You doing a lot of your decision making, a lot of your weighing consequences of things, a lot of your memory, a lot of your control over movement. Okay, so whereas the parietal lobe is important in, this is kind of cool, integrating your sensory information. So it's taking the information you're getting from your eyes and ears, and it's kind of presenting the world to you as one story, which is pretty wild. It's heavily related to things like spatial sense and navigation. Also important in things like language processing. Again, I'm just kind of quickly whipping through my notes because I want to just kind of highlight some main things. Okay, the occipital lobe, so that's the back red part, is the visual processing center of all mammals' brains. And this contains, probably most importantly, the main visual cortex, the primary visual cortex. Brodmann area 17 to be specific, but it's basically the visual processing part. This is, yeah, focused on things like visual tasks, visual spatial processing, color differentiation, motor perception. So a lot of things revolving around color, visual awareness, and also movement and noticing movement in the environment. Then just the last one I want to talk about, and again, these are on both sides. I'm just doing broad, right? So in real broad stretches, frontal lobe is doing a lot of the high-end processing, right? The parietal lobe is doing a lot of the integration of the information from the sentence. The occipital lobe is doing a lot of visual processing and spatial processing. And then the temporal lobe is involved in processing. It's really interesting. It's sort of making sense of things too, from a meaning perspective. It's involved in processing sensory input into derived meaning, like what does this mean for appropriate retention of visual memories and language and comprehend. So basically it's, let me just read that again because I kind of like blurred over it. The temporal lobe is involved in processing sensory input. So it's involved in being the computer part that's paying attention to the information that's coming in, and it's derived meaning. So it's giving meaning to it, and it's that meaning giving process that's heavily influenced by the temporal lobe is sort of what I've been talking about in different ways, that how it's paid attention to when the information first comes in has a huge shape on how it affects, well, how it's stored as a memory, how it affects things like your emotions, how you respond to it through thought with language. So this temporal lobe is also contains the hypothalamus, so like the part of your brain that's heavily involved in creating memories is also contained in that area. Oh, this might be interesting. So I'll just read this little part to you. Within the temporal lobe is an area of the brain called the hippocampus, which is associated with forming new memories, learning new things. The hippocampus has been studied many times in the past for its correlation with epilepsy. There seems to be an issue with damage to that area in epilepsy. And then I just put in brackets there, it's difficult to know what the link is if epilepsy leads to issues there or if issues there lead to epilepsy. Okay, so in the broadest, biggest strokes, it's like the frontal lobe is kind of your supercomputer that's processing, and it's where your thinking mind is. And your parietal lobe is trying to take in your sensory or your information and try to make sense of it, right? And it's sort of working with the temporal lobe, which is applying meaning and playing things off your memory system and creating new memories because the hippocampus is in there. And then the occipital lobe is like playing a huge role in making sense and displaying that visual information to your brain. It's all like an elaborate, amazing system. The 3 chapters in this course that are probably the most, I guess, kind of biology based would be the biological beginnings one, chapter 2, which was the biological beginnings, this one, chapter 3, because we're talking about an infant's developing brain and there's so much happening. And then probably the chapter 7 discusses puberty. So again, some chapters will be a little bit more psych theory, like say for example next chapter. But this idea of lateralization, or the idea that both hemispheres of the brain aren't necessarily doing the same thing. And you see here, it's just represented with like obviously like one half's not red and one purple, but it's just sort of representing the 2 hemispheres, the 2 sides. Remember, hemisphere means a sphere that's split in half. And before even birth, the different sides of the brain are doing different things. For example, a newborn will show, this is obviously not before birth, but once a baby's born, they'll show greater electrical brain activity in one side, in the left side, more than in the right when they're listening to speech. And so let me just read this to you. Lateralization is the specialization of the function in one hemisphere over the other. At birth, the hemisphere of the cerebral cortex have already started to specialize, with newborns showing greater electrical brain activity in the left hemisphere than in the right when exposed to sounds of speech. Of course, early specialization of the left hemisphere might reflect early auditory experiences, as we'll see. In the developing fetus is learning about the auditory world during the last trimester of prenatal development. So during that last trimester, that last stage of development, the baby's already hearing from the outside world. So in theory, if you could like study the brain waves of the baby while it was still in the mom, you'd probably be seeing this already. The most extensive research, or like where they've looked into this the most in terms of right-left, has been in relation to language. For example, speech and grammar are located more in the left hemisphere for most people, but some aspects of language, such as when it's appropriate to say certain things, is more right hemisphere. So sometimes if you have somebody that damages that right hemisphere, they might have an ability to speak. It might not impact their ability to actually form language, but it might really impact their ability to like know when things are appropriate. Right, so they might become all of a sudden much more awkward socially. So it's like the part of your brain that's thinking of what to say next and the part of your brain that's like judging whether it's appropriate and the good timing and all that stuff are controlled on different sides, which is pretty interesting. Thus, language is not controlled exclusively by the left hemisphere. It actually, most neuroscientists think that most complex functions, things like reading, performing music, making art, are actually involving communication of both sides. Right, because say even like playing music, it's like there might be one side that's more associated with the actual physical movement of your fingers on the guitar strings or whatever, and there might be another part that's sort of like keeping up with the melody. And so you might be, even though there's different parts being involved in different things, they're all firing towards the same goal, right? They're performing in a symphony. I don't know. That's just what I thought how to say it, but they're co-performing. Okay, so early, if you want to just have this idea that before the baby's born, the development of the brain and how it's wiring and stuff is basically all being informed genetically. So genetics are directing how the brain's establishing its original wiring, right? But then as soon as the baby's born, that brain, that wiring job gets placed into a world that's full of information, and in that interaction with that information affects the future development of that wiring. So it's like I say there, after the baby's been born, environmental experiences guide the brain development. Things like the sights, the sounds, the smells, the touches, so basically the sensory information. Things like being exposed to language, things like the intensity of making eye contact with another human being. Because you'll notice babies don't stare at other people's elbows. They stare at their eyes and at the sides of their mouth, specifically. If you want to read somebody's emotions, you should look at their eyes and the sides of their mouth, while assuming they're not masked. Right? Because, well, when I was a kid, they used to always say 90% of communication's nonverbal. That's obviously just somewhat made up, but so much of you reading what I'm saying isn't just what I'm saying. It's like my tone, how serious I look. Am I smiling? Am I frowning? Right? So the baby's trying to make sense of this. For example, one study found that mothers that have high quality interaction with their infants early in pregnancy or early in infancy tend to have infants that have higher quality frontal lobe functioning. So that's interesting because that's basically like direct advice. That's from a study by Berner, Calkins, and Bell in 2016. And it's basically looking at this idea that the better the quality, the interaction with mom and baby early, that's associated with positive results in terms of high quality frontal lobe functioning, which basically is like everything related to academic skill, right? Because if your working memory is working better, remember, but that's going to affect information processing, information retention, ability to make decisions, ability to weigh consequences. It's like all your higher end thinking. So the development of that is so important. So let's just say on the test I was to ask you what neuroconstructivist means. Think about this for a sec, right? If we're saying that the neurons are basically the cells in the brain, that how their patterns of action are constructed, that there's this back and forth between nature and nurture again, but the biological process is nature, environmental experiences nurture, how that interacts to shape the baby's development, that the development of the brain and the child's cognitive development are closely linked, like the development of the actual physical brain and the development of the child's thinking. And at a certain point, you're like, yeah, no kidding. Of course, those are directly linked, but they're not the same thing. One is talking about the development of the anatomy, and the other one's talking about what that anatomy then does. So it's almost like a hardware-software difference. Brain development influences or constrains a child's cognitive ability, right? So it can either improve it or it can hurt it. It influences how it happens. It can also constrain it if there's like some kind of injury or something. A child's Oh yeah, and then this next point is like it's even almost more complicated because how intellectually stimulated the child is. So if the child is like really inquisitive and curious, and if they're thinking a lot, and the kids are different obviously, and some kids are more curious and in that way, and that kind of thinking also influences. So the brain's like being influenced by its genetics, it's being influenced by its environment, and it's also being influenced in what's going on, the work that's happening in that child's developing brain. It's constructing the brain is the idea. So I don't have it written down here, but I think this is true just off. Oh, I do have it written down in my note. Yeah. So adults spend about, me and you probably spend about a fifth of our night in REM sleep. So about, well, a fifth, right? So like if we were to sleep 8 hours, we're probably dreaming somewhere in the neighborhood of an hour and a half to 2 hours a night. Now a baby is dreaming like half of the night, like somewhere between 40 and 50%. I'll read this to you. Adults spend about a fifth of their night in REM sleep and begin their sleep cycle with non-REM sleep. So you actually don't start dreaming right away. Right? But infants spend almost 50% of their time in REM sleep, and they often fall into dream sleep almost immediately. That's an important thing to know when you have kids. It's like when they finally fall asleep and then you set them down and they wake up, it's like you got to almost hold them a little bit longer even when it's the middle of the night and you can't wait to go back to bed, because you got to wait until they drop into a dream, and then as soon as they're in a dream, the likelihood of them waking back up is much lower. I say, and this is like an extra point, but this should be a main point, REM sleep also is, I say it also might promote brain development. It's like, I think we're only starting to realize how important sleep is, how sleep is building the brain too. It's wild to think how part of the design is that when the baby's little, it drops into dream almost immediately when it goes to sleep, and it spends a lot of its time there. Right? If it sleeps 8 hours a night, it's dreaming like 4 of those hours, intense immersive dreams, and that's not independent from brain development. That's part of it. So this next thing might not sound like the most interesting thing in the world, like talking about reflexes, but I want you to think of it from a different perspective maybe. That what a reflex is something that you know how to do without learning it. You did not learn it. That by definition, a reflex is an unlearned behavior. If someone comes right up to you and claps hard in your face, you're gonna blink. It's like no one had to teach you to blink in that scenario. Blinking is actually one of the only reflexes that we never lose. So now some you do lose. I'm going to show you. I have a chart that I'm going to show you in just a second. But for example, if you tickle like a little baby's face, it'll turn towards the tickle to feed, right? And it's like that's actually a survival instinct. Now, what's so fascinating is you don't have to teach babies to do that. They have certain built-in behaviors, whatever that means. The word we use is reflexes or instincts, sort of, but I think reflexes would be like the behavioral component of instincts. So I say there, newborns have a range of reflexes. These reactions to the world, reactions to stimuli, reactions to things, like touching the face, that's a stimulation, and then you move towards it. That's a reaction to a stimuli. These reflexes allow infants to respond adaptively to their environment before they've had the opportunity to learn. So I want you to think about that. That's like mind exploding. It's like for babies to survive, there's certain things that they don't have time to learn. If they had to learn the way they learned everything else, how to eat, they would die before they were able to learn it. So what's the idea that over thousands of generations, babies that have done that more have been more likely to survive? That genetic behavior has passed. That there's this thing called a rooting reflex. That's what I've been talking about, right? You see the mother touching the baby's face in this image. That the infant's cheek is stroked on the side of the mouth is touched, and the infant's head turns towards it. That reflexes allow an infant to respond to their environment before they've had the opportunity to learn. That's exactly what the point number 2 there says. But why I think that's wild is that it's like the baby's been genetically passed behaviors. The word we use in English for that is reflexes. So if you look at this chart, it's actually pretty interesting how it breaks down. It says like, okay, starting at the left top, it says like what the reflex is, the stimulation, that means like what causes it. The next column means like what the baby does, and developmental pattern means like how long does it last. So like slapping in the face, not slapping in the face, but like clapping right in front of somebody, that flash of or puff of air or the sound or the flash of light right in your eyes, the response to close your eyes, and that developmental pattern is permanent. But some, like this fact that when you touch a baby's hand, it closes, it grasps tightly, the grasping one, the third one, that disappears after about 3 months or no, sorry, it starts to go away after about 3 months and weakens after a year. That probably is evolutionarily back to when mom had more hair, if you're looking back hundreds of thousands of years. Because all apes do that too. That idea of like, and then what I want you to notice is like almost all of them disappear after a certain amount of time. Like it's like the baby's born with the ability to do certain behaviors at certain times that are completely developmentally and survival based. They're necessary from that perspective. Again, it's like I need to sometimes when I'm doing this presentation just realize that I'm not just reading the slides. I'm talking about something that's actually pretty incredible. It's incredibly adaptive that this is the way it works. Meaning incredibly likely to lead to survival in a variety of complex situations. That's what adaptable would mean. That able to work in a variety of difficult situations. So when I teach my connoisseur group, I usually spend the first couple lectures doing this like history of psychology kind of pre-lecture, where I go over a lot of the big names in psychology, and one of them came up with this idea of dynamic system theories, and his last name was Giselle, like Gessell, and Arnold Giselle. And if you check out the note underneath the slide, you'll see that his work was in 1934, and he was one of the earliest people in what would become genetics. And he saw that, like, well, why do kids start walking at about the same time? Why do they seem to go through? Why is it not more random? It seems like there's, if you read the first line, it seems like the motor development, so the kid's ability to do stuff, it seems to come about through some unfolding genetic plan. We would now just call it DNA. That he thought perception and action was coupled. Now that's an interesting idea. It means like I don't just learn to go like this. I learn to pick up things like a coffee. Me wanting to pick up this coffee and drink it is motivating me to learn that movement. That our perceptions of the world and our actions co-evolve. They're coupled. This is kind of explaining it in the next point. Infants need to perceive something that motivates them to act and then use their perceptions like that this feels, oh, this is hot, put it down. It's like it's this interaction between the motor system and the perceptual system. That the motor skills develop, and this is so weird to think of in a way that like so much of your movement is related to meeting the needs that your brain like you're having the thought that you want this thing, you want that toy, you want to play, you want this cookie, and the action you're doing to get it is almost like your physical tool to do it. And that the motor skills and the making that the motor skills are an extension of the brain's desires basically. And again, very interesting idea. This is one of the early people playing with ideas of genetics. Yeah, so interesting. So this would be like a dynamic system theory. So what that means is like it's not one thing. A dynamic system means, well, a system means just a bunch of things interacting, and dynamic just means like that it's complicated basically. And so it just means the actual way that works, like the relationship between the baby wanting food and the baby reaching for the food is complicated, but they're directly interacted. It's a system. It's a system that gets developed. Perception and action are coupled. They go hand in hand, coupled. They're not the same, but they go together. All right, my friends, I apologize a bit for the length of this presentation. It's kind of a big one, but this is quite literally probably going to be the longest presentation in the course just because there's so much kind of going on, and this is going to be the end of the first part. I'm going to do a part 2 video and I'm going to start into the whole visual perception thing and look at how this development of sight early on is happening, and I think you'll find it interesting. So I'm just going to kind of cut this up so that it's 2 videos. It's a little bit quicker to process and edit and stuff like that. And yeah, see you in part 2. Cheers.